What happens when a person's entire identity is built on a lie they tell themselves? I'm not talking about a small white lie. I'm talking about a foundational, structural myth of perfection, control, and most dangerously, absolute ownership. When the world stops reflecting that perfect version of who they think they are, the result isn't just a breakdown, it's a detonation. I'm John Cordray, a licensed professional counselor. In my years of clinical practice, I've worked with the intricacies of the human mind, helping people navigate the painful realities of relationships, identity, and grief. But today we're opening the clinical file on a comparison that spans decades, but shares a terrifying identical psychological DNA. Today, we're looking at the case of Betty Broderick, the 1980s socialite who became the face of domestic rage, and the modern tragic case of Michael McKee, a high-achieving vascular surgeon. On the surface, they appeared to be opposites. One was a mother in the high-stakes social scene of San Diego. The other was a man of science, a surgeon trained in the most precise and high-pressure medical arts. But as a clinician, when I look past the headlines, I see the same psychological fingerprints. Today, we're exploring narcissistic decomposition. We're going to ask the question what most people are afraid to answer. Why? Why does a person who seemingly has it all decide that if they can't control their reality, they must destroy it? And to understand that, we have to look at what happens when the false self is mortally wounded. To understand these two individuals, we first have to understand the main psychological theme that ties them together, the narcissistic wound and the violent pursuit of restoration. In clinical terms, a narcissistic wound occurs when a person's inflated sense of self, their grandiosity, is threatened by an external reality they can't control. Most of us have a flexible ego. We can take a hit, we can process rejection, and we can eventually heal. But for some individuals with high conflict narcissistic traits, the self is not internal, it's external. It's almost entirely built on what they own, who they're with, and how others perceive them. They don't have a self, they have a reflection. There are three key indicators we're going to trace throughout both cases today. The first key is object inconstancy. This is a developmental failure when the person cannot see others as separate, autonomous human beings. To Betty and Michael, their partners were objects, like a car, a house, or a trophy. And when that object exerts its own will, the owner doesn't feel sadness. They feel territorial rage. The second key is ruminative entitlement. This is the inability to let go of a perceived wrong. While others move through stages of grief, the narcissistic personality gets stuck in the anger phase. They replay the betrayal thousands of times until the rage becomes a physical necessity to act. The third key is the erasure of the victim. In both cases, the victims were no longer seen as people. They were seen as the source of the pain that had to be eliminated for the perpetrator to feel whole again. This is the why we're exploring. It wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a crime of identity preservation. Let's go back to San Diego in the 1980s. Take a look at Betty Broderick here. She was the architect of the Broderick brand. Betty became a socialite and spent lavishly on luxury fashion labels that mirrored the upper-class 1980s wealth. She had worked multiple jobs to put her husband Dan through both medical and law school. In her mind, she was Dan's success. She couldn't differentiate where she ended and Dan began. When Dan left her for another woman, Betty didn't see a marriage ending. She saw a theft. She saw someone stealing the mirror she had spent 20 years building. A clinical analysis of her behavior during the divorce reveals a total decompensation. Her thousands of obscene voicemails and her act of driving her car into Dan's house were just crazy acts. They were desperate, violent attempts to force Dan back into the role of the mirror. People often ask, why didn't she just take the millions and the settlement and then move on? As a counselor, I can tell you it wasn't about the money. It was about the reflection. Every time she saw Dan and the other woman happy, it was a living reminder that herself had been erased. By killing them in their bed, she wasn't just seeking revenge. She was performing a final violent act of ownership. She couldn't exist as a divorced ex-wife because that version of her was a failure. In her mind, being a murderer was far more powerful than being nothing. She chose to destroy the mirror rather than to live with a reflection she didn't recognize. Now let's pivot to Michael McKee. This case offers a chilling modern parallel. You probably heard this or read about this in the news recently. McKee was a man of extreme achievement, a vascular surgeon, a field that requires absolute control, precision, and authority. In a surgical suite, the surgeon has the final word, but his personal life didn't follow the same surgical rules. This brings us to the clinical marker of territorial entitlement. To a surgeon, control isn't just a preference, it's a professional requirement. You're trained to walk into a room, identify the problem, and solve it. Clinical theory suggests that for some high-achieving personalities, this professional authority bleeds into their domestic life. They don't just love their family, they oversee them. Here's the clinical why of that 400-mile drive. Allegedly, Michael McKee drove over 400 miles from Illinois to Ohio. As a clinician, I look at that distance not just as a physical act, but as a period of determined rumination. This wasn't just a snap. This was 400 miles of a narcissistic wound festering. In the mind of someone with territorial entitlement, the ex-partner, in this case Monique Tepe, is viewed as territory that has been annexed by an intruder, her new husband, Spencer. Spencer, in this psychological framework, wasn't just a new husband. He was a squatter on land that McKee believed still belonged to him. With Betty Broderick, territory was physical. It was a house and a social club. But for McKee, territory is also digital and emotional. Every time he might have seen a photo of Monique and Spencer or heard of their happiness, it was a violation of his boundaries. For the territorial narcissist, your happiness without them is seen as an act of aggression against them. Perhaps the most chilling clinical indicator here is its selectivity. The allegations point to McKee had entered the home and spared the children, but targeted the adults. In clinical terms, this is a surgical decomposition. He wasn't there to destroy his entire world. He was there to reclaim his territory by removing the obstacles. The why here is a terrifying belief that his right to control the narrative of his ex-wife's life superseded her right to exist. When we lay these two cases side by side, we see the evolution of the same wound. The trigger for both was the realization that their object was truly gone and thriving. Both Broderick and allegedly McKee developed a narrative where they were the ultimate victims. This is the victim-identified aggressor mindset. There are 5 psychological indicators of the victim-identified aggressor. It allows a person to commit murder while feeling they are simply seeking justice. The first one is a loss of the object. A partner leaves and thrives independently, and then the ego is threatened. The false self cracks and a severe narcissistic injury occurs. Then it's a ruminative replay, obsessive replay of the perceived betrayal. And then there's a delusion of victimhood. They convince themselves that they are the targeted victim, which leads to the 5th one, righteous retaliation. Violence enacted as perceived self-defense and ego restoration. Neither thought about the pain that they would cause to the victims or the children. Their narcissistic wound was so loud that it drowned out the humanity of everyone else. As a clinician, this is the most important takeaway. High conflict personalities don't just snap, they escalate, they ruminate. They build a case in their own minds until violence feels like the only logical conclusion to restore their ego. They believe that by destroying the offending reflection, they can finally stop the pain of their own perceived failure. We look at cases like these not to sensationalize them or excuse their behavior, but to learn about the red flags. If you're in a relationship where your autonomy is treated as a betrayal, where your partner can't see you as a separate person, please take that seriously. Understanding the why doesn't forgive the what. Betty Broderick remains in prison, and Monique and Spencer, the family is forever shattered. But by understanding the clinical reality of narcissistic decomposition and territorial entitlement, we can perhaps begin to see the warning signs earlier. Now I want to hear your thoughts about this case. Did you see some of the patterns that I talked about and how it made sense that they are very much alike, even though they're different people from different eras? If you like this clinical breakdown, I think you're going to really like this next video. Take a look. It's a very interesting case that I think you'll find very intriguing. I'm John Cordray, and until next time, good day and good night.